Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is standing over a sink, half asleep, moving a piece of plastic back and forth across their teeth without giving it a single thought. It takes 2 minutes, it happens twice a day, and almost nobody asks why. But that tiny object in your hand, that toothbrush, is the result of 5,500 years of human ingenuity, political battles, wartime mandates, accidental chemistry, and at least one prison cell breakthrough. And the paste you squeezed onto it? That story involves a Colorado dentist who noticed something strange about his patient's teeth, a 15-year war with one of the most powerful medical institutions in America, and a company that ultimately won not with a better product, but with better science. So today, we're going back to the very beginning, because the history of how humanity learned to clean its teeth is, without exaggeration, one of the most surprisingly fascinating stories you've never been told. Let's start around 3500 BCE, in the ancient city of Babylon, situated in what is now modern-day Iraq. At this point in human history, there are no pharmacies, no dentists, and certainly no aisles of mint-flavored gel. What there is, however, is a very practical solution that humans had likely stumbled upon long before anyone wrote it down. The chewstick. A thin, pencil-sized twig, usually cut from a tree with naturally antiseptic or aromatic properties, one end gnawed and frayed into a soft, bristled tip. You would work it around your teeth and gums the way we'd use a brush today, and the result, by any reasonable measure, actually worked. The wood wasn't chosen at random either. Ancient peoples across Babylonia, Egypt, Greece, and parts of Africa selected specific trees whose sap or fiber contained natural compounds that fought bacteria, freshened breath, or hardened the gum tissue. This wasn't guesswork. This was accumulated wisdom, passed down across generations long before anyone had a word for microbiology. And the Egyptians, who documented so much of their daily lives in extraordinary detail, clearly valued these sticks enough to bury their dead with them. Tomb excavations have turned up chewsticks alongside gold jewelry and sacred amulets, which tells you something important. To those people, a clean mouth wasn't a luxury. It was a part of a dignified life, something worth carrying into the next world. Now, while most of the ancient world was experimenting with one stick or another, a particular tradition was taking root in the Islamic world that would prove remarkably durable. The Miswak, a small twig cut specifically from the Salvadora persica tree, sometimes called the toothbrush tree, became embedded in Islamic religious practice roughly 1400 years ago, appearing in the Hadith as a recommended act of personal hygiene. And here is where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. The Miswak has never gone away. Today, more than 600 million people around the world still use it as part of their daily routine, and when modern science finally got around to analyzing exactly what was in the wood, the results were striking. The Miswak naturally contains antibacterial compounds, naturally occurring fluoride, calcium, silica, a list of active ingredients that reads like the back of a toothpaste tube. People had been using it for over a millennium before any scientist could explain why it worked. They just knew that it did. That gap between practical knowledge and scientific explanation is one of the most recurring themes in the history of oral hygiene, and we're going to keep running into it. Move forward to 7th century China, and the story takes its next major leap. During the Tang Dynasty, sometime around 619 to 907 AD, craftsmen began producing something that would look genuinely familiar to modern eyes. They took animal bone, sometimes bamboo, carved it into a handle, bored tiny holes along one end, and threaded through tufts of stiff bristle harvested from Siberian hogs, the coarse neck hair of pigs bred in the colder northern regions, where the bristles grew thick and firm. They were then secured with glue or thread, producing a handled brush designed specifically for cleaning teeth. This is, without meaningful exaggeration, the direct ancestor of the object you used this morning. And it's worth pausing on that for a moment, because while Chinese craftsmen were producing handled bristle brushes in the 7th century, much of Europe during the same period was cleaning teeth, when cleaning happened at all, with cloth rags, salt, chalk, or ground charcoal. The methods weren't necessarily ineffective. Salt, in particular, is genuinely abrasive and has antimicrobial properties. But they were far removed from anything resembling a brush. Europe would eventually catch up, but it would take a very long time, and the catalyst would come from an unlikely place, a London prison cell. The year is 1770, and an Englishman named William Addis is locked up. The exact nature of his offense has been debated by historians, but most accounts suggest it involved inciting a riot. What matters for our story is what happened after dinner one evening inside that cell. Addis, apparently a man of both practical ingenuity and remarkable patience, kept a small leftover animal bone from his meal. Using a tool he fashioned or borrowed, he bored a series of tiny holes into one end of the bone. He then obtained small tufts of bristle, likely from a guard or from cleaning supplies available inside, threaded them through the holes, and fixed them in place with glue. He had, in the middle of a prison sentence, invented the modern toothbrush. When Addis was released in 1774, he didn't set this idea aside. He went into manufacturing. He began producing his bone-handled, bristle-tipped brushes commercially, selling them at first to the kind of wealthy customers who could afford personal hygiene novelties, and then more broadly as demand grew. By the time of his death, William Addis had built one of the most successful consumer goods companies in Britain. His family continued the business for generations. And for the next 400 years, give or take, the basic design barely changed. The handles evolved, ivory replaced bone, then early plastics replaced ivory, but the bristles remained animal hair, primarily sourced from Siberian hogs, for an almost unbroken stretch from William Addis in the 18th century to the eve of the Second World War. But before we get to the war, we need to talk about what goes on the brush, because the story of toothpaste and fluoride is one of the great slow burn dramas in the history of public health. And it begins, as so many unexpected stories do, with a dentist noticing something strange about his patient's teeth. The year is 1901, and a young dentist named Frederick McKay has just arrived in Colorado Springs, Colorado, to set up his practice. Almost immediately, he notices something unusual about the local population. A significant number of people have teeth that are stained, mottled, brownish, sometimes pitted, a condition that locals have apparently just accepted as a normal regional quirk. But McKay is a careful observer, and he notices something else. The very same patients with stained teeth have dramatically fewer cavities than he would expect. The decay rate is remarkably low. These two things, unusual staining and unusual resistance to decay, seem to be connected. The question is how. McKay spent years collecting data, corresponding with other dentists, trying to find the common thread. The investigation eventually pointed toward the water supply. Something in the local groundwater was causing the staining but also, apparently, protecting the teeth. It took decades of work, with McKay joined eventually by a U.S. Public Health Service researcher named H. Trenley Dean, to isolate the culprit. Fluoride. Naturally occurring fluoride, present in the local water at higher than average concentrations, was causing the cosmetic discoloration but simultaneously providing powerful protection against tooth decay. The logical next step was clear. What if fluoride were added to public water supplies at carefully controlled, lower concentrations that provided the protective benefit without the staining? In 1945, the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, became the first city in the world to deliberately fluoridate its public water supply. The results were monitored carefully. Children growing up with fluoridated water showed dramatically lower rates of cavities. The science was, by any reasonable standard, compelling. But compelling science and smooth policy are not the same thing. The push to add fluoride to toothpaste, and to have that toothpaste officially endorsed by the American Dental Association, met fierce resistance through the 1940s and 1950s. Some of the opposition was ideological. Some was political. Some was a more familiar story of institutional inertia and corporate interest. The Addis seal of acceptance, that small emblem on a toothpaste box, was enormously valuable marketing territory, and the association was not eager to hand it out. For 15 years, the data piled up while the establishment hesitated. It was Procter & Gamble that finally broke through. Their toothpaste, Crest, had been reformulated with a stabilized fluoride compound called fluorescein that genuinely worked, and unlike previous companies that had asked for the Addis seal with promotional materials, Procter & Gamble did something different. They funded rigorous, independent clinical research. Actual trials, conducted at actual universities, with actual data. In 1960, the American Dental Association granted Crest its seal of acceptance, the first toothpaste in history to receive it. It wasn't a story of enlightenment descending from on high. It was a story of one company deciding that the most effective marketing strategy was to make something that provably worked and then prove it. Meanwhile, another front of dental innovation had been quietly developing, and like so many great inventions, it came not from ambition but from compassion. In 1954, a Swiss doctor named Philippe Guy Woog was thinking about his patients. Not all of his patients could manage a manual toothbrush. Polio survivors, people who had experienced strokes, individuals with limited motor control or physical disabilities. For these patients, the 2-minute brushing routine that most people performed without thinking was difficult or impossible. Woog designed an electric toothbrush, which he called the Broxodent, as a medical device. A tool of rehabilitation and accessibility, not convenience. When it was introduced in the United States in 1960, it was initially marketed through dental offices rather than drugstore shelves. It was a professional instrument first, a consumer product second. The idea that electric brushing might be better for everyone would take much longer to settle into the mainstream. And then, in 1992, an electrical engineer named David Giuliani took the concept somewhere new. Giuliani had been working with ultrasonic and fluid dynamics technology, The kind used industrially to clean crude oil residue from pipelines and precision equipment, and he had a thought. The same fluid dynamics principles that could blast contamination off metal surfaces at the molecular level might be applicable to cleaning tooth enamel and disrupting bacterial biofilm along the gum line. The Sonicare toothbrush vibrated its bristles at sonic frequencies, generating a cleaning action that reached beyond where the bristles physically touched. Where a manual toothbrush produced somewhere around 300 strokes per minute, the Sonicare operated at 31,000. Not just faster, categorically different. The technology demonstrated measurably better results for gum health in particular, and it established sonic cleaning as a serious category in dental care rather than a gimmick. But now we need to come back to the bristles. Because all of this innovation in handles and paste and motion means very little without the part of the brush that actually does the work. And for 400 years after William Addis sat in his cell, the answer to that question was the same: pig hair. Specifically, the coarse, stiff neck hair of Siberian hogs, imported along global trade routes that stretched from northern China and Russia to manufacturing facilities in Europe and America. It was an imperfect material in several ways. Animal bristles are hollow at the tips, which means they harbor bacteria. They soften when wet. They don't dry particularly well. But they were the best available option, and the supply chain, though long, had functioned reliably for centuries. And then the Second World War cut it off. When global shipping lanes were disrupted, when trade routes through Asia became militarily contested territory, the supply of Siberian hog bristles became unreliable and then essentially unavailable. Toothbrush manufacturers needed an alternative, and fortunately, one had already been invented, though not specifically for them. At DuPont's laboratories in Wilmington, Delaware, a brilliant and deeply troubled polymer chemist named Wallace Carruthers had spent the 1930s pursuing one of the most ambitious projects in the history of materials science: the synthesis of a strong, flexible, water-resistant fiber from petrochemical building blocks. He was searching for a synthetic silk, something that could replicate the properties of natural fibers without depending on biological sources. What he created instead, or in addition, was nylon, the first fully synthetic polymer fiber, strong enough to be woven into fabric, flexible enough to be drawn into fine thread, and, as it turned out, perfectly suited for toothbrush bristles. Unlike animal hair, nylon bristles could be manufactured with controlled tip geometry. They dried faster. They didn't harbor bacteria in the same way. They were, almost immediately, superior in nearly every measurable respect. But Wallace Carruthers never saw any of this. He suffered from severe and persistent clinical depression throughout his life, describing it in his personal correspondence with a raw, unflinching clarity that makes for difficult reading even today. In April of 1937, 11 months before nylon went into commercial mass production and changed the textile and consumer goods industries permanently, Wallace Carruthers took his own life. He was 41 years old. The invention that would revolutionize everything from women's stockings to surgical sutures to the bristles of the toothbrush you use every morning, he never saw it reach the world. Nylon toothbrushes entered the consumer market in 1938 under the brand name Dr. West's Miracle Tuft toothbrush. And with that, the basic form of the modern toothbrush, nylon bristles, a shaped handle, mass-produced at industrial scale, was complete. The subsequent decades would bring refinements: softer bristle grades, angled necks, rubber grip inserts, indicator bristles that faded when it was time to replace the brush. But the fundamental object was set, which brings us to perhaps the most counterintuitive part of this entire history. Because here is a remarkable fact: despite all of this development, despite the thousands of years of chewsticks and Miswak and Tang Dynasty bristle brushes and William Addis and fluoride research and nylon and electric motors and sonic vibration, the majority of Americans in the 1930s and early 1940s still did not brush their teeth regularly. The habit simply hadn't taken hold at a cultural level. Dental health was widely poor. The products existed. The scientific case for using them was established. But behavior had not followed knowledge, as behavior so rarely does. What changed? It wasn't a public health campaign. It wasn't a particularly persuasive advertisement. It wasn't a scientific paper or a dentist's recommendation. What changed? It was a military mandate. When the United States entered the Second World War and inducted 16 million men into the armed forces, the military conducted medical examinations that revealed, among other things, catastrophic rates of dental disease. Tooth decay and gum disease were causing significant numbers of otherwise eligible recruits to be deemed unfit for service. The military's response was characteristically direct. Every soldier was issued a toothbrush and toothpaste. Brushing teeth was not suggested. It was required. Twice a day, without exception, enforced by sergeants and drill instructors who had considerably more tools of persuasion available than a dentist suggesting you floss. For the duration of the war, 16 million American men brushed their teeth every single day because the United States Army told them they had to. And then the war ended, and they came home. They came home to families and communities that had not necessarily shared the habit. But these were men who had spent years forming an automatic morning and evening ritual, men for whom a toothbrush was as standard an object as a belt or a pair of boots. They brought the habit with them. They passed it on to their children. The consumer market for dental products, which had grown during the war, exploded in peacetime. The ADA began its endorsement program. Fluoride entered the conversation. Crest and Colgate competed for shelf space and consumer loyalty. And within a generation, the idea that a person brushed their teeth twice a day had shifted from an unusual practice to an almost universal assumption, not because science had finally persuaded the public, not because advertising had worn people down, but because the most powerful institution in the country had simply made it a rule and enforced it long enough for it to become second nature. So the next time you're standing there, half awake, running that brush across your teeth out of pure habit, consider what it took to get it there. 5,500 years of accumulated human knowledge, from Babylonian twig chewers to Tang Dynasty craftsmen, a man sitting in a London prison finding productive use of a Tuesday evening. A dentist in Colorado who couldn't stop wondering why his patients' teeth were brown. A chemist at DuPont who changed the material world and didn't live to see it. And 16 million soldiers who came home with a habit they'd been given by their government and kept for the rest of their lives. The mundane and the monumental are rarely as far apart as they appear. Sometimes the most ordinary objects in your life contain the most extraordinary histories. You just have to know where to look.